Okay, starting my stream now. Hopefully everything is good and I don't have any more technical difficulties today. Okay, cool. Live sharing this with my team. Live streaming now. Deep dive into buttons. HSDS React. That's the title of this thing. Cool. Cool. Awesome. Great. Hello everybody. Happy what day is it today? Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for tuning into this stream, or for watching this video after the fact, doesn't matter. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today we are going to have another deep dive into HSDS React, and we're going to take a look at buttons today. So I'm going to share my, nope, this is my live dashboard panel. One of these days I'm gonna get something right. Still used to this, so with my current setup, I only have my monitor. I'm in a co-working space. I only have my monitor and my laptop. I don't have a lot of screen real estate to have all these things up everywhere. So, anyway, it's a pain. It's a pain to try to figure out which monitor to show what and where to keep my my video streamer thing running and what to show on screen. So today we're going to take a look at buttons within HSDS React. I'm going to pull up the storybook so that we can see what we're talking about. So buttons are interesting. Buttons are probably one of my favorite pieces of UI just because of how often the user has to interact with one and how complicated a button can be, and just how many ways that you can present a button. The button can look like a standard button. It could behavior-wise, it can act like a card. It can look like a link. There's a lot of variations. You can combine buttons together. A button can be combined with like a select or a drop down. A button can be a drop down trigger. All these things. Buttons are fantastic things. So inside of HSDS, there's a single button component, but there's actually two versions, and this is really interesting. So this was a decision I made when we needed to update the styles of how buttons rendered within HSDS React. And buttons were one of the first components I ever built within this library. In fact, no, I didn't actually build this component. Maxi, one of our lovely front-end engineers here at Help Scout, he was the one who built this component originally inside of HSDS, then called Blue, which leveraged where the styles came from Seed, which is a CSS framework that I created. He brought that in and he created the button component, which is great. I think he might have been one of the first people to help contribute to this library other than myself. So thank you so much, Maxi. And this served us very well for a long time. The button was good. It had a bunch of different styles. Like so. This outline button was added a little bit later to help with one of our designs. They had states built in. Disabled whatever you can theme. Oh, these were also added a little bit later as well. But yeah, they had sizes, all that stuff, all that you can want from a button they had. But we needed to change the button's styles for beacon. So in order for us to do that, and these style changes came like mid-project. So the best way I thought to do it was to basically rebuild the button and kind of enable it using kind of like a feature flag. So if I wanted to use an HSDS button, by default, if you just did that, you get version 1 of the button. But if you did this, you would now get version 2 of the button. This is I think it's a very clever kind of solution to rendering either the older button or the newer one. And having this kind of mechanism built right into the component allows for us to seamlessly migrate from one to the other without having to do gigantic refactors or anything. And fun fact, this is actually connected with Prop Provider, which is a handy dandy thing within HSDS React. I did a deep dive on that a while ago. By that I mean a couple of days ago. Okay, so I've had that Prop Provider. Right. So with prop provider, you can target any component you want and give it any props you want. So if I did button and then I just did version 2, by doing this, any button that renders within this prop provider tree will automatically be a version 2 button. So like this is really great because now you're able to dramatically refactor chunks of your application or views or whatever it is just by using this prop provider, which is might be something that you have anyway. And you just pass in this version 2 button and you don't need to touch any of the buttons. They just know how to transform themselves to version 2. So that's really great. So one of the reasons why I had to rebuild buttons is, I mean, from a style standpoint, they kind of look the same. There might be some changes in font and padding and so on, but from an architecture DOM node tree standpoint, they are very different. One of the big changes that we needed to do was, I don't know if you can see this via the stream. Can I zoom in? Ah, yes, I can. I love this. If you do control with if you hold down control on a Mac and you do like the scrolly thing, then you can actually zoom in and out like that. It's fun setting. So if I click on that, you can see that there's a blue ring that appears. It's a focus ring that you can get with any kind of focus style, sure. But one very, very minor detail that might be a little bit hard to pick out is that there is a 1 pixel gap between the button and the ring. So this was specified by our lovely designer, Buzz. Very, very good at what he does. Buzz, he's very good at what he does. And this is a challenge because traditionally you would add a focus style using either like a border property or a box shadow even. But you can't do that directly on the button because then there would be no gap. Therefore, you would have to use some sort of like either another selector or like a pseudo something, so that basically to simulate another selector so that you can do some offsets in order for you to generate that ring. Okay. Oh boy, how do I zoom out? There we go. Yeah, so that was one challenge. The other one was to enable out-of-the-box support for adding icons alongside text. So we have an icon component within HSDS React. So right here, really nice. You just basically say icon and name, and then you pass in what kind of icon you want to render, and the icon renders. And there's a varying array of sizes. You can pass in what size you want, and the icon will render to that size. The icon, by default, the color of the icon inherits from your text color. This is done by a very interesting CSS property called, so if I pretend I had an icon class, CSS class, this is my lovely pseudocode we got going on here. So we have, sure, it's a CSS file, whatever. So for the icon, if you did something like this, current color is actually a native CSS variable that's available in any browser today. And what it does is that it inherits colors from your text, and you can apply that color to anything you want. So the icon, I mean, it's basically a span wrapper around SVG eventually. So what happens is, okay, I gotta change this to SCSS, so there's some sort of nesting going on. Again, this is not live coding. I'm just writing pseudocode. So you would do something like this. I think path is the only, yeah, path, sure. There are other shapes inside of SVGs like circles and rects and stuff, but path is typically the main one. And you can do this. So by doing this, the paths that render the icons themselves will get the current color of your text, which is then defined by whatever it is, the parent selector, your body, whatever. And this is great because now your icons magically match your text. And within my icon class, if I wanted to do something like is muted, and then I override the color with something else, like 999, which is a light gray color. So if I did that, the SVGs and the paths and all that kind of stuff automatically change their color as well to match this rule. And that's how, this is the nice thing about cascading style sheets is that you can do stuff like this. So icons, fun little tangent into icons. So with the new buttons, you're able to add icons directly out of the box, and it knows how to align itself with text. So, man, those of you who have done UI on the web, you will know that trying to align icons with text is often very painful. And the reason for that is this deep dive about buttons or icons? It's both. See, there's buttons and an icon. I can talk about icons. Great. Okay. And this is actually important because this feeds into why I need to rebuild buttons. So typically, in the past or in the present, depending on your current tech stack, to render an icon, people usually use some sort of icon font, and you'd have like a selector, be it I, be it span, be it EM, whichever one your current framework or application uses. And I'm just running default HTML now. Okay, let's put in the HTML. And then you'd have some text like this. I'm gonna fun name. Oh yeah. So you have some text like that, and you have an icon here, and this icon, let's call it a buddy icon. It's your buddy. It's fun, and it renders within a button of some kind. So this is a challenge because depending on the display of your icon class, well, okay, fine. Let's just call it icon buddy. Depending on the display of your icon class, and the size of it and stuff like that, it might not know how to render with your text. Because how text knows to align with each other is they use display and line. This is the inherent values. And they rely on line height, which is, I'm not sure what the default value is, but typically people set it as 1.5 or like 1.65 or something like that. So 1.5, which specifies the size of your text bounding box, and depending on your font, it'll align itself correctly within that size. Oh yeah, and font size is a multiplier of that somehow. So 1.5 times 13 should be 18, something like that. I don't know. I'm not good at math. I'm good at browser, CSS, JavaScript math. So I believe it's 1.5. Let's just double check. No, I'm wrong. So it's like 19.5. Okay. I'm just going to round it to 20. So the size of your text is now 20. What if your icon is 16? How does it know how to align itself next to your text? So at this point, people would jam CSS class names like, oh, I don't know, make a display inline block, and oh yeah, vertical align center, or do all this kind of madness in order to align the icon with the text. But now, if you have additional things that need to, that might need to appear before and after, the vertical lines all messed up, and it's just bad. So now we're talking about buttons now. So this is why I needed to refactor the button in order to account for these varying use cases. And how you do this, or how I chose to do it, is instead of your button, now we're in React. Yeah, button.js. Yeah, great. Oh, no. TypeScript, sure. So instead of your button just rendering your child or children straight like that, they actually render it within a span. And this span, I'm going to give it a class name of button content, sure. All right. So this span, there's some CSS now, some fake CSS. Button content. What this span has is it is a display flex with align content center. I believe that's the API, and that will then, regardless of what you are, align yourself to the center of one another. And that will take care of the center alignment of things, of anything you put in. And that is how you're able to get button and text alignment things out of the box. And in order for me to support this correctly, I needed to refactor the button markup in addition to adding the support ring. So yeah, so that is button plus icon. Lots of things to think about. It's the nature of building component libraries. And the other thing I wanted to touch upon is when you go to build small components that are designed to be reused in something like a component library or a design system or a framework or whatever, the most complicated components or the most complicated bits of code that you will have are the ones that appear the most often and get interacted with the most often. And because we're dealing with a web UI, those interfaces are typically buttons, dropdowns, and inputs, and text areas, which are kind of like dropdowns, and links. So those components, I mean, that's what the foundation of the web is. It's basically some text that you would see and how you would interact with that text to do stuff. And you would do that in the way of forms. This is just basic HTML now. So you would do that in the way of forms, and the forms receive user input through selects or dropdowns, inputs, buttons. And that's how you interact with information. And with that parallel, the most complicated components within HSDS React are those components and all the mechanisms that go into powering how those things work. So just because the UI piece is like a tiny thing that you see, like a button, don't let that fool you into like the complexities of it. Because a button, even though maybe you've done HTML or CSS before, it's a different animal if you're going to build a reusable, stable, flexible thing within something like a design system or a component library. Great. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some code now. I need to figure out how to set this thing up for live streams so that the content looks a little bit less chaotic. Because I've seen other folks who are fabulous at doing this live stream thing. Anyway. So here is the entry point for our button. Unfortunately, this was coded not unfortunately, but this was coded when I was introducing type systems into HSDS React, and Flow was the one I picked at the time. We're currently converting things over to TypeScript. So you might see like this @flow at the top. So this was built with Flow. Okay. So the only property that this thing receives, this wrapped button receives, is version, because this is the entry point that determines whether to render a version 2 button or the standard legacy version 1. And this is the one that you get when you instantiate or when you bring in button into your application, and you do that. This is the first bit of code that you hit. And depending on the version, it'll render version 1 or version 2. I'm not going to take a look at version 1 at the moment because it's older stuff. We want to focus on version 2, and version 2 is coded a little bit nicer. So let's take it. So we're going to look at that. Oh boy. Right. Apologies if you might hear noise in the back. I have some noise canceling software and stuff. Hopefully it'll block the noise in the back. If you don't hear anything, then ignore whatever it is I just said. Okay. Let's check out how the button actually renders. So, when the button renders, it's actually wrapped with a higher order component called route wrapper. What this does is it gives our button magically the ability to work within a React router-based environment. So if you're in React Router, you can leverage things like exact, anything that you can pass to a standard link. So you can pass in a to. This is how React Router is able to navigate from and to different URLs. Exact and stuff. No, those are routes, so it's different. But to, this is the magical property that you need. And button, because sometimes you need your button to behave like a link. With this route wrapper higher order, it gives button the ability to do that. And all of that complicated logic is abstracted away. The button doesn't care about routing. Route wrapper takes care of that. In Route Wrapper, the original implementation of this was done by Brett. Thank you, Brett, for so much for doing this. This really helped during the implementation of links and buttons and stuff through the initial building of Beacon and various stuff within our main application. And this has since been refactored. I did this relatively recently. Why is it not in TypeScript? It's fine, whatever, it's fine. And what this does is that it taps into this very specific context key, router. So React Router, up until more recently, in order for its various bits to communicate with each other between the router, the routes, and the links, and the nav links, and so on, is they used the older React 15 and lower based context API with a very special key called router. And since then, they've leveraged the newer React 16 create contexting to power all the things that they need to do. So this solution only works for, I can't remember what version of React Router, 4.3.1 or something and below. This only works for that. So this route wrapper taps into that context key and does a check for any time you want to click on the component that is trying to wrap, in our case, a button. So when you click on the button, it'll try to get the history from the router, and then it will fire your onClick handler if you chose to give it one. And if the to and the history is available, we have this handy dandy kind of fetch thing that you can do where you do a fetch before you engage with this history change. But anyway, this is the main thing. The history object is the one that controls how routing works within a React Router setup. So we're just pushing the specify to the history, and now your routes change just by clicking on a button that was wrapped with route wrapper. And that is how a button within within HSDS React is able to function within a React router context or not. And this route wrapper wraps our links, our nav links, and other things that are designed to work in either context, which is great. Because React Router is one of the most, if not the most popular routing libraries. So being able to support that out of the box with buttons and stuff, where the user doesn't have to like style things or fake button styles under the link component from React Router is fantastic. It's just anytime you can build something that just works out of the box for the user, it's fantastic because they can just get on with their work. They don't need to think about any of this typically very complex stuff, and they just do whatever it is they need to do. All right, let's take a look at the button itself. So the button has a bunch of default properties, and this is a pattern that I've done since the very beginning. I am a heavy believer in smart defaults. So if you don't provide the button with any kind of props whatsoever, the button should be able to render correctly out of the box. And once you start providing it with props, that's when you can manipulate it and do fun things with the button. So always have default properties for everything. It's a very, very good pattern to follow. And if you do specify properties that are functions, give it a no-op or noop function so that it doesn't break when you go to click your button or do whatever it is you need to do. This make button UI, this is quite important. We'll get to that in a little bit. So this is link indicator. So we had to roll back on React Router support for certain things within the application. This will be added back in very, very soon. Just for now, it's commented out, so you have a little to do reminding myself to add this back in. So we can ignore that for now. So the render method. It renders a bunch of classes based on a bunch of different criteria. And this is how I choose to adjust the UI based on the properties that you give it. So because we have a styled component-like setup with our CSS and JavaScript, typically what you can do is something like this. So I'm about to render a button. Here I'm doing my template string literal, whatever it is that's called. And now, let's say I have some styles like I don't know, font weight bold, because the font weight should be bold in buttons or something. So let's say I want to render some disabled styles. One option you can do is to do something like this. Props disabled. And so this syntax looks very strange if you're not used to it. Even though you're used to it, it still might look strange. I've done this before. I've worked with CSS and JavaScript for a while. I still don't really like it. It's still strange to me. So if it's disabled, then do something like pointer events none. I believe that's it. And lower the opacity to 0.5. So this is one thing that you can do with styled components, where now the DOM node that you're trying to style will automatically get these styles based on the properties you specify. So now if I render my button, which we'll use, just say const button UI, which renders a button UI underneath the hood, and I do disabled, the pointer events will now be blocked and the opacity will be 0.5. So for certain things, I feel like this is okay. But for most kind of purely aesthetic changes, I don't really like this because, I mean, if I jump back to, we don't need portal for now. If I jump back to button, you can see that there's a ton of different variations that can happen in order for you to render the styles. So if you had a lot of these, your styled component starts looking something like come on, okay, starts looking something like this at the very least, and like at this point I can't even read it. I don't even know what's going on. It's very difficult for me to wrap my head around. So by using something like class names, which you can get by doing npm install class names, which is a library created by Jed Watson, I believe. Let me just class names Jed Watson. Yeah, he builds cool stuff. Fun fact: HSDS React, our class names thing is one that I've written. It's not the one powered by coming from Jed, and that's just because I wanted to keep the library as small as possible. So we just wrote our own lightweight version of it. Anyway, by doing this, you're able to tap into various properties that you give your component and specify a modifier class name to tack on to eventually the computed CSS class. So here, by default, it would be pretend we're in CSS world now, v2. And if you give it I'm just looking at this. Why is there no disabled class? Give me a second. Disabled. Oh, okay. There are disabled styles. They're just applied in a different way. So ignore me for now. So let's say I want to change the size of my button, and you want to make it small. So now it'll be is small, and if it's a primary button, it'll get is primary, and if it happens to be in an error state, I believe it's danger. And if that happens to be in a specific theme, then is note. I believe note might be one of the themes. And if it happens to be a block, then you can do this. And I think that's it. Right. So this is one of the reasons why I really like buttons, is because from this one single thing, you can have so many variations of how these things can be combined in order to create a single user interface thing. So here, we're just with the button and passing in some properties, it can now be a primary button who happens to be small, but happens to be in a danger state that is used within a note context, so it's now a theme of a note, and you want it to be big, so now it's a block button. All those things can happen at the same time, and sometimes does. So if you were to have that logic here, like this, it's just nuts. So by providing eventually these styled components with some class names, instead of doing this, you can now do this. Is SM, this is a small, then you would change the height to whatever. Is block, and then you would do like display block with 100% and so on. For me, this is way easier to read. I think maybe not only because it's smaller, you don't need to like jump between a string and JavaScript and try to figure out how the parsing works. This is easier to read for me because coming from the world of SCSS, SAS, or less, these are the patterns that you already have. So making that cognitive jump is way smaller, and it's just easier to kind of like understand what's going on. And I think reducing, another thing that libraries are supposed to do is to reduce the cognitive load for the developers that go to implement it or to maintain it. And this is just one of the mechanisms built inside of something like HSDS React that helps facilitate that. And it was a design decision that allowed for us to build things in this way. One moment, please. All right. So that's what, I'm going to close this file. We don't need that anymore. So that's what all of this class name stuff is for. Here we go. Button UI. What is this? All right, get button UI. Let's take a look at this method. What is it? All right, cool. So, like I mentioned earlier, this has to have routing support and work like a link if you specified it to work like a link. So in order for the button to render either a link or a button selector, we need to go through this little stream of logic. And after it determines whether the base tag selector should be an A or a button, we'll make the actual button UI. And this part is a little tricky because regardless of whether you use styled components or... Oh, no. So this is only applicable for not the latest and greatest versions of Emotion and styled components, because now they have mechanisms in order for you to do this. But if you're on Emotion 9, like myself, oh boy, these are nuts. I will get into this. So in order for me to either dynamically make a button or a link, I have to wrap the styled function with another function that gets that first and then generates the styled component and then passes it through again. Fine, that's what the make button UI is. However, I only want to do that once or only when like the props happen to change instead of every time per render. I just noticed a boo-boo. I need to actually target specific properties to look for and memoize. Anyway, that's just something that I need to fix after this stream. So by memoizing this function, in theory, if I did it right, it would only generate the button UI once. It would only construct the styled component once, and we'll get our eventual either a DOM node or a button DOM node. And that's how the button UI renders. Great, cool. Get focus markup. This is the guy responsible for rendering the focus ring. And it itself is another styled component, focus UI, which renders a bunch of stuff. So there's an animation built into this focus UI, which is a very subtle thing that appears when you click it. It kind of animates it, which is nice. And it needs to have a bunch of CSS in order for it to offset itself in order for it to get the 1 pixel gap between itself and the button. So before the focus UI renders, we need to determine whether or not we should show the focus. And the focus UI is only applicable for certain button types. So if I jump to here, right here. So that we don't want the focus ring to appear here, or else it would look weird. and we don't want it to appear here either. So we have to exclude certain button types so that they don't get focus rings. So we have this little guy, we have some sort of matcher here, and then we'll check to see if it's disabled, because if it's disabled, we can't show a focus state because you're not allowed to focus a disabled button. Based on these conditions, we will know whether the focus UI should render or not. And once it does, it'll render, and these are some properties that you can do for the focus UI. I will get into this first, not last, and last thing in a bit. And now for the... Now I'm looking at the code that renders the content inside. How on earth did I do this? Oh yeah. Cool. So this is the thing that automatically knows how to handle the icons. So it's going to loop through or map through all the children that you pass into the button. And if it finds that one of them is an icon, don't do anything with it, just render it out. Otherwise, make some modifications to the thing you passed down. So isComponentNamed is a very special function that taps into the I guess prop provider setup, or in this case, okay, backtracking. Some other mechanic inside of HSDS React. So when you do prop provider, when you prop connect a specific component, let's see. Well, a cow. Cows are cool. So when you go to connect your cow component, how this particular function works is you pass it a namespace of some kind. In case we'll call it cow. So when you do this, it registers cow internally inside of the provider or the context of the component library to map your particular component to that particular namespace, and it's stored in memory for throughout the lifecycle of your application. So when this happens, this is really nice because by default it will know how to apply a display name to your component. So if you named your cow component super cow, this particular function will set the display name of super cow for you. So when you check your component out inside of Jest or React DevTools, that's what you see, which is nice. The other thing that we can do is, because there is a cache or a registry set up for this particular component, you can then target that reliably with another function, which is component named. So I'm just checking to see if this particular child is named this particular value, which is icon. And this is very important because when you do a React children map through all your children, the only thing that you can check for is the most parentist entity. So if your component happens to be wrapped by a higher order function component or multiple, for HSDS React they are, because when you do a prop connect icon with the namespace of icon, the thing that gets returned is a wrapper, right? This is what you get, a prop connected icon, and inside you have your icon. So if you were to do a React children map throughout all your children and you're trying to check, hey, is this particular guy, does it have a display name of icon? This will fail that test because it does not. It has a class name of like prop connected icon or whatever the heck it is. So even if you don't use prop connect, if you use React router, if you use Redux, and you use their connect mechanism where you can map states to props and do fun things like that, then again, the thing that renders in your component tree looks like this, and if you were to map over this to detect whether this thing is an icon, it also fails that test. You need some sort of mechanism to be able to check whether or not the component that you're mapping through is of a particular namespace, regardless of how deep it's nested. And is what you get with isComponentNamed, because it's checking for this component against this particular namespace within the HSDS component registry in cache, in memory. So prop provider, all that complicated system allows for this to happen reliably. And I think that was one of the main reasons why I built prop provider to begin with. Now, with that understanding, we're going deep here, folks. So with that understanding, we can now reliably check to see if something is an icon or not when mapping through components. And if it is, then don't do anything. Otherwise, enhance it slightly. And that is how you render content within a button. My goodness. All right. And I think one of the last things that we need to touch upon is what is going on with this stuff. Is first, is not only, is last. And this suffix. I think that works similar to these guys. This is suffix was something I added more recently to fix a certain thing. Oh yeah, that was the thing I added, I think, to facilitate this specific UI. Oh no. Where is it? Input action. Here we go. This suffix was a thing I added to facilitate the rendering of a button within an input magically. And it just knows how to handle itself, and there's also like, yeah. So you can have multiple buttons, and then with the input you can have, it knows how to like adjust the flow of the UI so that the content doesn't run into the button and does fancy things like that. We'll get into inputs maybe another day. I did a live coding thing with inputs where I talked a lot about inputs, but I mean, I only scratched the surface there. So this is first, is not only, and is last, these properties, they are part of, where is it? Control group, which is another component. And what this does is give me a second. I need to update these examples because now you're rendering version 1 buttons. Which is, I mean, they follow the same mechanism, so this thing can still apply. So control group is a component that allows you to combine varying types of control UI together to simulate this button group, segment control, or whatever it is interface. So here I have 3 buttons next to each other. They know how to round, I'm going to zoom in. They know how to round their corners. They know how to render so that when you focus on something, the focus UI doesn't like get trampled or doesn't get hidden over another thing. So they know how to prioritize their Z index. And yeah, so they know how to do all this. This is provided by this control group mechanism, and this allows you to combine. The heck? Oh, that's not zoom. That allows you to combine buttons with other things as well that happen to be powered by this control group mechanism. So here I have an input that is able to work alongside of a button, that is able to work alongside of some sort of prefix thing, prefix component. Here we have a select next to an input, and they know how to magically round their corners. Oh, here we go. Here's a V2 button next to an input. Right. So in order for the button to understand that, it is wrapped by something that provides it with this would be in control group item. One moment, please. Yes. Oh, yes, of course. Okay. So when you go to use, if you want to have your button with another button or with another input or something, you would use a control group component. Thank you, VS Code. Sometimes this autocomplete stuff is helpful. Sometimes it's not. control group item. So I have one item slot there, I have one item slot here. Indentation. So if I put a button here, if I put a button here, this is how you're able to combine buttons next to each other and they know how to like magically round themselves and do all that kind of stuff. So once you do this, the control group item will modify the button slightly and pass it in either if it's the first, if it's the last, or if it's somewhere vaguely in the middle. Geez, indentation. So this particular one will get its first. This particular one will get is last, and all these ones here will get is not only. And based on that criteria, the button will know how to either round its right edge, round its left edge, or round both edges. And that's how you're able to create control group like interfaces where you can combine buttons next to each other, buttons next to inputs, and so on. So here we have varying bits of UI just because of this mechanism here. So here we have a split button dropdown where you have a button on one side, a button on the other side, excuse me. And this button is smaller for reasons, and it is able to power a drop-down interface. Constructing components from other components with other mechanisms that are built under the hood is nice, and what's really nice is for all this stuff to be done for you and the user to never have to think about this. And that stress is then put onto the component library maintainers and, and contributors. All right. So the last bit. How on earth do the buttons render their styles? In terms of CSS and JavaScript, or just CSS in general, this is not exclusive to HSDS React. Buttons have one of the most complicated array of CSS, just because, like I mentioned, the ability for buttons to render in so many different types of states, whether it's large, small, happens to be block, happens to be primary, happens to be all these things. They need to be able to be combined with each other. So here is how the button CSS works. We have a general config map or object, if you will. And this is where a bunch of variables are stored for the button. This is a convention that I decided to go with within HSDS React. If you use something like Sass or less, you typically declare your variables at the top or some sort of variable file or something. This is basically emulating that same mechanism, but for JavaScript. So I have my configs for my button all declared here. There are a lot. So I have radius, icons, offset, or whatever, and these are all what you're seeing here. Okay. Danger, success, everything under primary. These are all the styles that are required to render a primary button. These are all the styles that are required to render a primary alt button, secondary alt, tertiary button, default button, a link button, and disable button. These are just aesthetic styles that change their color, border color, and all that kind of stuff. Inside between, what is it, 12 to 100, over 150 lines of code just to specify colors. So we have that. So now we have some focus stuff. Great. So now we have to declare some size stuff, font size and whatnot under size. We have XL, we have large, we have medium, we have small, we have extra small. And for suffix, we need to adjust some things for the suffix. Great. So over 200 lines of code just to specify configuration things. Great. Now let's make our button. So when we make our button, we have some initial styles just to set the foundation for our button. We declare some hover, some focus stuff, and whatever is all here. And remember the is first, not last control groupie kind of magically knowing how to round the edges? That's what this comes in. So the border radius of the edges of the buttons are determined by these classes. And here we go. We are going to be making various button styles. So how I decided to do this was, because of all these configurations defined here, like so, there's a lot. To keep my code dry and to keep myself sane, I created functions that generate these styles for me. In Sass, you can do this with mixins, which is native to the language. In CSS and JavaScript, you're able to use JavaScript functions, which are nice. So let's not focus on the primary ones for now, because they do something funky. Not funky as in interesting, not funky as in hacky or bad. Make button styles. What does make button styles do? Give me a second. Make button styles. Is that what I called it? Make button kind styles. Of course I called it that. Sure. All right. So we are going to render a bunch of a single modifier class with a bunch of different settings. So kind. This is like secondary. All right. So we are rendering a secondary button with, and config is all the config variables attached to the secondary button. So we're able to render the background color, the border color, the color, and a bunch of other things for focus, hover, hover active, hover, all the combinations of all those guys. And we have this render style for prop function. And what this does is it'll basically try to find this particular key within this particular config, and if it exists, render it as this particular CSS property. So this is nice because all the configs for all the various styles, whether it's secondary, tertiary, primary, whatever, the keys aren't like exact. The shape isn't exact because for certain button types, maybe it doesn't need a border at all, or maybe the paddings are slightly different. Things like that. There's varying levels of things. So having a function that takes care of that logic to render the stuff is really nice. Now I can just like reuse this function everywhere and it's fine. And that's what you're seeing all over the place here. And here I have some make danger styles, make success styles, make disable styles. Okay. So make danger style and make success style, what all that does is that it passes through the config with a very specific kind of state, danger or success. And okay, one moment, please. We're going in deep today. Deep. Inception level deep. So we need to render a state modifier onto our kind modifier class, so it's nested. And then we need to render certain kinds of CSS properties based on the config's state. So we take a look at one of these guys. What? Where is state coming from? It's coming from somewhere. One moment, please. All right, I know danger lives somewhere. Here we go. So yeah. So this is one of those things where it might not be available for all the button types. So for primary, at least we have one. So it'll find these specific keys. If it exists, then it'll loop through and render these specific properties. Cool. By the way, what is GetColor? GetColor is a function that can retrieve a very specific hex value based on our color scheme in our brand, from our brand. Blue 500, blue 600, these are various shades that you can pluck. And this is really nice because now you're not hard coding hex values all over the place. You are using essentially a variable to target a hex value. And this hex value can change. It doesn't matter as long as you can reliably get it in a consistent way throughout your code base. That's the key, and that's what this GetColor mechanism is. All right, so we're able to map through the config of some button, and we're rendering all the styles for it. Great. What is this make primary styles? Why is this one different? So this one is different because you are able, as a user, within Beacon 2, our embeddable application, to customize the UI based on a specific brand color. So you can choose whatever color it is you want, and the UI needs to respond accordingly. And the button is hooked up through a higher order provider somewhere called theme provider, which comes with the CSS and JavaScript library that we have. And those specific color values are generated into the theme. And with this make primary style thing, it's going to try to pluck those specific values from that object somewhere. And if it's available, use it. Otherwise, fall back on the color values defined within our config here. So we need some way to kind of intercept the make button kind styles thing with possibly enhancing the values with the values that we get from our theme. And that's what this one does, and that's how we're able to dynamically style primary buttons and whatever based on specific theme options. So if I take a look at greeter card, this one, yes. So in this specific example, I have my card, I have my button, I can do things. I set up some fake brand colors here. So by changing it to blue, this primary button knows how to change itself to blue, purple, it looks like that, and so on. And it knows how to change its active click color. So now you can see that it's darkened, and now we see the focus ring go in. And that's it. So with almost 500 lines of CSS, we're able to dynamically generate styles for the button depending on a wide variety of requirements. And that is all the mechanisms that go inside rendering a single button in the world of HSDS React. And like I said before, it's very, very complicated stuff with a lot of mechanics going on. And the reason for that is the more complicated or the more often your UI appears in your application, and the more often the user engages with that UI, the complexities of your UI reflects those two multipliers. And that's why buttons and inputs and so on are so complicated. And what I really like is all of this stuff is abstracted from you when you go to implement one of these things inside of whatever application you go to build. So hopefully you found this deep dive helpful into the wonderful world of buttons, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Take it easy.